I mean, you can't sum up a childhood in a term, but feeling like anything that you did was not right or up to snuff or whatever it is, that definitely went through my whole like childhood and into my 20s, even probably up to when we left to a certain degree. Something bad happened at the house. Something was broken. And I said, look what happened that I didn't do, which is like a funny thing to be like, haha. But then you think about like, why would a little kid feel like he needs to point out, like, look at this thing, a bad thing happened, this broke, and I didn't do it. Like, I know I didn't. So like, I'm not going to get in trouble. Because it was always the, well, whatever happened, like, well, Matt must have done something.
The World Tomorrow. The Worldwide Church of God presents Herbert W. Armstrong.
And I'm here to bring you the truth, because you don't hear this from any other voice. No one else is telling you the things that God is telling you through me. He's speaking through me.
We must not judge what God is most surely doing. Right now, there are no coincidences. Everything has a meaning and is an opportunity to learn to be faithful by being obedient, even when it's uncomfortable.
Those of you that have not surrendered to God to really be obedient to Him, you don't agree very far with me, do you? Of course you don't. You can't. You're carnal-minded, and the carnal mind is enmity against God. The carnal mind is hostile toward God.
The Lord let me experience what it is to be a new bride. You know, I'm not worried about what I'm about to say, though it may be graphic. We're coming to the Lord, and if you can take it, beyond the veil is the chamber. That's the wedding chamber. The Lord told me that.
Mattie, a few weeks ago, you told me something that really, really upset me. A story from your childhood that I did not know about, and I was hoping that you would talk about that today.
Yeah. So this is coming up on, hard to believe, like it'll be 20 years next year since this happened. So 19 years now, roughly. So I was just a young fella, 15, I think is when this happened. And there was another family in the church. And at this time, we were still having services like at the house. Like we didn't have a church building. It was relatively early on in the development of what really later became Crusade Church. And there was another family that had come along, and they had a couple of kids that were near my same age. And there was one in particular, and she was like a year and a half younger than me, something like that. Not quite 2 years younger. But we were contemporaries, and we were really good friends too. We just got along really well. And as happens when you're getting into your teen years, you start to like boys and girls. And so there came a point where we figured out that we liked each other. And I won't go into everything because there's really not a whole lot to tell on that front. But we were like a secret boyfriend and girlfriend, essentially. So I was 15 and I think she was 13 or around there at that point. I don't think this had gone on very long, but I remember she had written me a note or something and dropped it on accident at the house, like after services. I don't know if you remember this better. And maybe if you want to jump in on some of the details, but I remember like she dropped this note, somebody found it, and then like all hell broke loose.
Her father came upon the note, somewhere near the front door in the downstairs. And he said, I thought to myself, what has God laid at my feet? And he opened it and read it and knew it somehow indicated that you guys had some romantic entanglement. And, I don't know if he confronted her first or if he went to Dad. It could have gone either way. But all hell definitely broke loose.
Yeah, it was not these two too early to have a boyfriend girlfriend relationship type thing, like the way I would view it now. Like you might have a talk with your kid and be like, it's a little, or whatever. I don't know. You guys would know better than I do. You have children. But I think anybody looking at this from the outside would know that the response that we're going to describe is the last thing that a normal parent should ever do. So I just remember, like, it's probably an understatement to say like all hell broke loose. I remember, similar to the story that you told, Ashleigh, like mom's state, probably because she's thinking back to what happened with you. And I think there was a lot of that tied to it, is that it almost felt to them like, oh no, like it's
happening again.
Matt's going down that road type thing.
Yeah.
Like we're going to lose him. But I remember mom's state just being awful, very similar to the ways that you described how she was, like weeping and just like beside herself. And then dad's state. And some of this is firsthand from what I experienced with meetings with dad. And some of this is like from our brother Michael, who was in the house when I was kind of put away at that point. And he got to kind of see the dad's state. But the way that it kind of all came about is that me having this boyfriend, girlfriend style relationship with this other person in the church had put dad's entire ministry at risk. And Michael, our brother Michael, was telling me a story just a few weeks ago. And I think I had heard it before, but maybe it's one of those things I had logged away, where in like the day after maybe that this all came to light, dad was like on the living room floor, I guess on his knees, like weeping and gnashing of teeth kind of situation, and like crying out and saying that, I believe he said that God told him that he was now in the same category as these great men of God from the scripture that had wicked sons. And he brought up, I think it was Eli in particular, who had those wicked sons. And if you read that story, like the things that they were doing, like, yeah, that would be wicked. That's bad. But he was equating what that story with what I had done.
And also that he was a great man of God.
Yes, yeah. Equating himself to great biblical men
of course
of God. But that was kind of the state in the house at that point, as I can recall, was that it wasn't just, oh no, we've got to get a handle on this situation, or we got to get a handle on Mattie as he's getting into his later teen years. It was like apocalyptic.
It was, and it should be understood that dad hijacked the narrative and would use catastrophic language, as you've pointed out, to frame family events. So to the degree that you choosing as an adult woman to get married became a whole other beast by a different name. It's hard to even go back and understand and try to grasp how he was able to accomplish that, but he did. And in this case, he did it right away. And the rest of the family was completely under his sway. So when he had this reaction, we assume, in a way, he knows something that we don't know. This is as serious as death, basically, to him. And so we followed suit. We also felt that dread and the anxiety and the fear for you and the absolute hysteria surrounding this really benign and normal thing for teenagers to do.
Yeah. There were more than one letter was written, but I remember one in particular where I was written a letter, and it's just similar. It's in the same vein as what a lot of the things that you read already in an episode. And he also wrote this girl a letter also. And she was in the letter, Dad described her as a harlot. And then to me, I was a whoremonger.
Yes.
I was 15 years old.
And you guys had kissed. Let's just get that straight.
Yeah, let's set the stage for this. We're not
Yep.
talking about I got this girl pregnant.
Mm-mm.
Like,
Even so.
Even so, but like we had kissed and had
to drive it home.
A teenage summer romance
Exactly.
is what this is. This was in July and August when this came to light. So we had a teenage summer romance, and this was the response, which was apocalyptic. That's the best word I can think of for how it was. So, and you can help me fill in gaps maybe here. This kind of thing with Dad, this was like the huge one, but this kind of thing with Dad had happened after this more than once. So I don't want to mix up any stories. But I do remember a meeting with Dad.
Was this right when it happened? Like
pretty soon after. I don't think it was like the day of or anything like that.
Like when he became aware of the letter, how did he let you know, I know about this?
So as I remember it, Dad set up a meeting with me and Mom and Dad and this girl and her parents. I don't really remember details of the meeting. Again, apocalyptic. We have already kind of described some of Dad's mental state from what like Michael remembers of that time. So that was kind of the general flavor of the meeting and what was going on as I remember it.
Were you afraid? I mean, did you fear the worst, or do you have any ideas about what was going to happen as a result of them finding out?
Yeah, I don't really remember what I thought. I don't think I had any footing at that point, or at least I don't remember like what my state was, my state of mind. But I know after that meeting, I was sent like to my room upstairs. There was no like time limit put on this. Like I didn't know how long this was going to be, but I was like put out of the church, essentially put out of the family. But I was 15, so he didn't have anywhere to send me. He couldn't send me out of the house. So I was sent to my room upstairs. I didn't like eat dinner with the family. Like I don't remember interacting with anybody. I think Mom would like for a time was bringing my food up and like leaving it in front of the bedroom door. And then later during that time period, I was allowed to come down and eat downstairs, but not like with the family. Like I remember I would like sit at the table like alone while people were eating in the living room.
How far into it was that?
Weeks into it. But I don't know what you remember about that time, but I just remember like isolation from everything and everybody. And at that time, like, I think we had talked about this yesterday, like you didn't have a phone, like no computer, like no connection to anything going on. Like you're just alone. So it was like me at 15 up in my room. The last thing I heard from anybody and from Dad was how awful this is, and like hearing Mom crying downstairs. Like that's kind of like my mental state was what was going on.
I want to give a little bit of context and say that this was worse in a way for Dad. The reaction was even more so heightened because of who it was. This family we had sort of taken under our wing. They had 3 daughters. You know, we were supposed to be this model family, and we were showing them the way to be a healthy, godly family. I mean, it was explicitly stated. We were having social engagements with them for that purpose alone. We would have, family game nights, and we're going to show them how it works because they were newer to Christianity. And so what was really at the heart of this is Dad was deeply embarrassed and himself ashamed that this came from our family and it was this girl in this other family. And so again, it was about him and how he felt that this reflected on him as a father and pastor. And to your question about what else I recall about that time, I know that it was a badge of honor for Dad that you could be heard wailing and crying from upstairs, closed in your room. He was happy about that. He thought that that was necessary and appropriate. And this is a sidebar and a huge regret of mine, but Dad came home one day and told me that the young girl in this situation had made a comment about wanting to go to a church event of some kind that we were having. And I was so enraged that you would not eat, because there was the time when you didn't eat, and were up there just, sackcloth and ashes, bawling your eyes out.
I fasted for 3 days and 3 nights during that period of time.
No water either. Yeah.
I remember I didn't want to cheat, but I had like a wet, like terry cloth, like rag, like a, that you used to wash your face. And like I would suck on that some to try to get just like a little bit of moisture, but I didn't want to like drink water because I wanted to do the real thing, but I was like coming apart at the seams because you can't not eat and drink for that period of time and it not take a toll.
And you're 15, like you're growing.
Yeah.
And also nothing to distract yourself. That's huge.
No.
If you can find, if you watch something, I don't know, on your phone, your computer, something. But there was nothing to do up there when we were grounded. And, I had a family member say to me when commenting on this time, we weren't even really supposed to look at him. Like, you were shunned completely. And that is the way that it went when any of us were grounded.
Mm-hmm.
It was a complete cutoff.
It's psychological torture, like
Absolutely.
you mentioned earlier. No question about it.
And then you're sent up there having shame heaped upon you, which is so corrosive and damaging and so difficult to carry at any age, but as a young person, just debilitating. And it feels like, I don't want to speak for you, but like there's just no way out. You just did this thing. You can't fix it. You don't know if you can be redeemed. And then you're asking yourself, what's wrong with me? Why would I do this? I must be especially damaged and bad because who else would do this? And then again, to your point earlier, we're looking at our siblings like they don't do this.
Mm-hmm.
They toe the line, It's so difficult to feel that way when you're at any time, but when you're young, it's just especially difficult and damaging, I feel like.
And I do remember, to kind of give some more context, like early, I'm talking like within the first day or two of me kind of being sent away upstairs, there was another meeting, but it was just me and Mom and Dad. And of course, Mom stayed again, like you would expect, because she's already heard what Dad's about to say. But that's when Dad kind of laid it out again, like the apocalyptic gravity of what I had done, the great evil I had done, the sin, is that I am putting the entire ministry that God was working through him in jeopardy. So all of the prophecies that we had heard from the African brothers when you guys went about our church and Dad's ministry and all that, that was potentially done now because of me. And
Because
so
you kissed a girl.
yes. So it wasn't just like, oh, you screwed up. No, it was like the potential end of everything that God was trying to do with me. Like, you may have just ruined it. So then Dad drops that bomb. And there's no like, here's what you need to do or like any of that. It's just like, I'm going to let you know this terrible news. And then he's gone. So then that's probably where the wailing and crying part for me comes in, because it was just dropped on me. Like, everything about my life that I knew at that point was all centered around church and our church family and Dad as a pastor. And then maybe he can't do it anymore because of me. Like, I was the cause.
Well, there's some inconsistencies here, because the reason that his ministry was in jeopardy, as he said, was because of this scripture that says one of the requirements for a pastor is to have your children, what is it, under control and in the faith, something like that. And so you were out at that point. And so I think Dad would, I'm sorry, you, Ash, were out at that point. And I think he got around that by saying that you were still technically a believer.
What about the whole narrative that I wasn't even supposed to be? I assume that was probably used as
he definitely employed different.
Okay.
It was whatever was useful at the time. But you know,
I thought he got around it by, well, she was never even supposed to be here anyway.
He definitely used he would talk about you in sermons sometimes. He would mention you and say that you were, a part of a like-minded background church in Joplin, Missouri. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he'd just gloss over everything else.
Yeah.
My harlotry.
Yeah. He
glossed
over the magnitude of your great evil.
Oh. Okay, so he didn't tell you you're going to be grounded for X amount of days. It's just basically like, this is so awful. I don't even know what's going to happen, but you just have to get out of my sight. You have to be in your room, removed from the family.
Yeah. And the only information I had about what was going on was when he would come up and do those, I don't know if you want to call them meetings, whatever they were. He would come up and drop bombs and leave. So it's like the context for what was happening was that I was away and that I might have ruined everything at that point.
How often did he come up?
So I do remember at one point, and this is so long ago now that some of it's fuzzy, but he had started like taking me every so often during this period of time, like on long car rides. And which, looking at it now, is it's like I was completely isolated. He had set the groundwork for how terrible the thing I had done was. And then he would drive me around for an hour and just pound what he was saying into my head for an hour at a time, or more. And that's at the point that we, of course, were not like on good terms by any stretch, but he like bought me a Bible, and like there was some like Max Lucado book that he also bought me that was almost like homework. Like, here is your material. The only connection to any outside world was Dad. And then here's your, reading material for the day, which I threw myself into because I thought that was the way to get right and get back in,
And you
Fix yourself.
fasted on your own volition, but because that was expected.
Yes.
Right. That's how you repent is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. He didn't say you need to fast, but it's almost like what he did with you. It's like, well, the way towards repentance, the reading and praying and fasting and that kind of thing. So he didn't have to say, like I had known just, through our lives in the church, what the expectation would be that was the way I could get back to some, place that was resembled normal. But I remember at one point, like I had some kind of journal thing that I was writing prayers in, which I kept for a long time. And the last time I had looked at them, it made me sad. Just looking at, because it reminded me when we talked about this during some of the early episodes, like you're repentant and so sorry for how awful you've been. Mm-hmm. But then you're looking at it now and you're like, what did I do? Like, but at the time you're so desperate. Like it's almost like, you're the only one reading this. Mm-hmm. It was that way for me, but I was so desperate. Like I'll do whatever I need to do, to be right.
Well, because love is completely removed from you, and you do what you have to do to get that back. So at what point did you realize how long it was going to be that you were going to be isolated?
So I was reading some scripture. I don't remember what it was. I feel like it had something to do with Moses with the 40 days. He went up on the mountain, then he came down, and then he got onto the Israelites, and he went back up for another 40. I think, was that Moses maybe?
Yeah.
But I had read that scripture passage, and I wrote in my book 40 days ? Because I'm looking for Lord, give me some kind of answer of what's happening. How am I going to get out of this? Is this just life now forever? Because when you're 15, you don't have the wherewithal to think what's the logical conclusion? I'm not going to live in my room for the rest of my life. But at that point, I didn't think that way.
And you probably didn't want to ask him either.
No, definitely not.
Yeah.
It was almost like, I don't know if you remember this. I'm sure you do. When we would go to the grocery store, you might get something at the checkout, but you will not get it if you ask for it.
Yeah, I remember
If there's a candy bar that you want, if you ask for it, you're for sure not getting it. But if you are good the whole time, and then we get to the checkout and mom or dad remembers, then you might. So it was almost like that, where I was like, well, I don't want to screw it up by asking for it. I might get in trouble.
Or that would send the message to him that you aren't serious about your repentance.
Yeah, that I'm looking for an end.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I had written that down, and on one of our indoctrination car rides, I brought that up, and then imagine that the Lord quickened to him that, that is right. And I don't remember how far we were in at this point, but that was that does, I feel in the spirit kind of thing. That is right. It would be 40 days, 40 nights kind of thing. So then he retroactively decided that's when it would end. But when it ended, it still, I think we maybe had talked about this a little bit at some point, but it wasn't it's over, all is well now. You had to prove your repentance. I remember that being a thing, walking on absolute eggshells for I don't know how long after that.
What about the rest of the family? Was it a slow easing back into making eye contact with you or acting like you do exist? What was that like?
That's how I remember it. I don't know, after the isolation part ended, what do you remember anything about the transition?
I know, not specifically. I know that Dad fixed because he was never going to give up power and position. So he fixed the, oh, woe is me, you're jeopardizing my ministry, by saying that, God showed him, I believe, and spoke to him and said, the devil came at Matthew with a sword, but God beat it into a plowshare. Mm-hmm. And basically broke up the hard soil of your heart to where you could actually be saved. And there was the expectation after that when you came out of that isolation and that punishment, that you would be a changed young man, and you were expected to make your commitment to God through baptism.
And I did.
You did.
I was baptized.
Because what else would you do?
Yeah. And also, it wasn't just purely like self-preservation. Like when just the circumstances of everything that happened, like I bought into it.
Of course, it's a psychological,
Yeah.
like a warfare
Like
tactic.
it got me where he wanted me to be.
Yeah.
So it worked.
Just, I don't think we should skip over the fact that you were isolated and separated from the family as a child. That is, I mean, that's so abusive on so many levels. When I heard that, I had to take days and days to process that. I mean, that is so troubling to me. I had no idea things like that were happening. Sorry.
And this wasn't, I want to put it in the right context too. This wasn't just like a kid being grounded.
No, you were, this was solitary confinement, which all of the studies now that you can read on solitary confinement in the prison system illustrates how damaging it is to criminals. And these are grown men who have murdered people. And it's still horribly psychologically damaging, like long-lasting damage. As a child, if Child Protective Services had ever gotten wind of that, you would have been removed from the home. You don't isolate a child and lock them away and separate them from love and their support system. It's just
from touch.
Cruel. It's absolutely cruel and inhumane.
Yeah, that is a good point.
What'd you say?
Too.
Touch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
touch and any interaction any even remotely positive interaction, like it was devoid of that. Again, like there was a point where I could come downstairs to eat, but I wasn't eating with the family. But before that, like food was brought up, like the whole point was like, you go away.
The point was to inflict shame on you too. So even if at the end you can come down and eat, but you can't eat with the family and no one's supposed to look at you, that in and of itself is just a different twist on the punishment.
Oh, and I remember also, like you had asked earlier, like what the transition was like. And maybe you can speak to that too some more, but like I remember it being very slow, in particular with Dad, because you know how he would be. Like he had to see that you were actually repentant. He couldn't, if you're like, I repented and I'm good. Like there was no like, okay, cool. Like, no, he had to wait and watch you and see. So there wasn't much interaction. It was very cold.
But there was an undercurrent of resentment. I always felt that. I knew it. He resented each of us when we did things that he did not approve of. And he would stay angry with you for a long time.
It just shows like this is how far he's willing to go to maintain control. Literally will do just about anything. He makes it so bad for you so that you will never do something like that again.
Yes.
Why would you ever choose to put yourself through that? It's cruel. I mean, just flat out cruel. And there's no empathy on his part. This is what really bothered me, just thinking about this and thinking about how long 40 days is. And especially if you are alone and you're not interacting with anyone and you don't have things to pass the time, you don't get to exercise or kind of like shake off your energy, you don't have anything to read except for your Bible and Max Lucado. You don't have television or a computer or phone or anything like that, and you're devoid of human touch and interaction. it's mind-blowing to me how you would know your child is upstairs in this state, and you can hear him crying as well, and not one time do you think, maybe I've gone too far?
And then I've always thought about what mom's state of mind must have been during that time, just for you guys downstairs, because she can't do anything about it, because dad's standing firm that this is the way it has to be. So
That
your
had to
mom's
been
just listening to this and like hearing what dad has to say about it and the gravity to which he's giving the situation. Like, I can only like
How do you not
imagine.
just want to die? I don't know. How do you survive that as a mom?
And then also, like, you probably know a lot better than me, frankly, but like what it was like for the other party. I know it wasn't the same as like what dad was doing with me, but what was it like for her?
Well, they were not capable of imposing upon her the same um, degree of harshness that you had. And I didn't actually finish what I was trying to say earlier, and that was that when I heard that she was talking about some event the church was having and wanting to attend that, I was so angry, because to me, what was happening with you, Matt, was what was appropriate and necessary, you know? And I was indignant, and I got in my car and I drove straight to their house, and I tore up those stairs and flung her bedroom door open and shouted at her. Like, I berated her because I thought she just doesn't get it. She doesn't get the severity of this, because dad.
And the parents allowed that.
Oh, yes. I said, where is she? And they said, upstairs. They let me go. And I was, demanding information about the relationship that had been going on. And, I believe that she and I have talked about that, and I have apologized to her, but it's a very difficult memory, because you just almost cannot believe that this really simple and pretty basic, easy to understand scenario that played out could have been distorted and twisted into this completely, nuclear type of event that required this type of reaction. It is mind-blowing. I don't know how to go back there and put myself in that frame of mind, but that further illustrates the power that dad wielded over us. And it was another one of those things where, if you hear something enough times, it's just going to be the way it is. And dad is a talker, and, we just didn't hear the end of it. And then he fixed it by saying that, oh, God was in it, and he let Satan tempt Matt, and Matt failed, but this was his opportunity to get real about God. And look, I'm going to baptize him. And
the redemption story.
Yeah, and he's going to be, powerful member of the church. And it almost feels a little like, I heard someone say once that when they were a teenage girl, that their mom would say to her and in front of her a lot, like, I never have to worry about you. I never have to worry about her. She's a great teenager. She's just such a good teenager. She's a great kid. And in her mind as a teenager, she thought, okay, I believe that. I am a good kid. And she sort of stayed out of trouble. And that was part of the reason, because that was how her mom described her, and she believed it. And I kind of feel like dad saying, oh, I see. Satan attacked you and you failed. You failed big time. But God was in this, and you're going to be a, mighty soldier for the Lord, and welcome to the family type of thing. Like you reinforce what they already think needs to be, and it would then encourage you to become that thing.
Well, he had a vision, if you'll recall, where I was preaching mightily. And Dad, I've got bad news. But
No.
yeah, he saw me in the future.
You're preaching mightily.
He
That's
saw me in
right.
the future as a young man preaching mightily, which is amazing that God wanted exactly what Dad wanted.
I was going to say, how convenient.
Yeah.
Wow.
Just right on the same wavelength. It's awesome. But I remember like even the transition, like coming back to church, because obviously during this time of isolation, like,
Oh, that's right. So you weren't in school and
Yeah.
you weren't allowed to go to church. So that all you were doing is just in your room until the final weeks when occasionally you went on a car ride.
yes, an
Which-
indoctrination car ride with Dad. But like my whole like friend system and everybody I knew, like it was at the church. So like the transition back into the church was of course incredibly awkward because you're coming back in like, yes, I am the great sinner that you've heard about, the terrible things that I've done, because I didn't know like what was going on at church, but I made assumptions about, and of course people were looking at me like, I don't know how to describe it.
Did
Didn't
people
he
embrace you or no? Or were people wary?
I don't remember people being cold, but I don't remember like a welcome parade type thing either. I think it was just like, let me slip back in. And
Didn't he require you to speak?
was that the first or the second time?
Well, I don't know. But you definitely were asked to get up in front of the church and address everyone regarding that.
Yeah. I'm not going to remember the timeline very well. Just going to be frank, honest, and open about that. But there was a second time that I and this particular girl in the church struck up a romantic relationship, again, of the same ilk as the first one, like summer romance style thing. Nothing serious I mean, the way I look at it, especially now. But I remember at that point, we were both a little bit older. It wasn't a long time after, but we were both a little bit older, and I was like serving a purpose at the church within like I think I was playing guitar and then like running the audio for the sermon or something like that. I think we had started like doing some video stuff at that point. So he couldn't, this is my point of view now. This is why I think it happened the way that it did. He couldn't put me out of the church and isolate me because he needed me. I was serving a purpose for him at that point in the ministry. So I think I was not allowed to like play guitar on the stage for a certain period of time, but then I could still come and like do the other work that needed to be done. And that was the point where he like made me and this other girl write down detailed of everything we had done and where.
Like every kiss.
Yeah, like anything we remembered, like where did you kiss and where did you hold hands, and like all the like completely detailed is what he was asking for. I don't remember if it was the first time or this time that he when we were kind of reinstated back into normal church life, that we had to get up to the pulpit in front of everyone. I don't know if you would categorize it as like an apology of sorts. I don't even remember what it was, but we had to like
confession.
Essentially, yeah. And he wasn't asking that we say everything we had done up there or anything. It was bad enough that he wanted it in writing for himself.
That particular time, you were working at this place called the Water Store.
Yes.
And you had this vehicle that Dad maybe had bought, and you were driving.
So Yeah, I mean, this is like a little side thing, but he was buying and selling cars at this point, like used cars, and he got one that he thought would be a good fit for me. So he and mom like gifted me. It was a 99 Chevy Blazer. It was red and I liked it. And then dad got something else several months later. And it was a Suzu Trooper, and it was white and it was really cool looking. So I traded that to him because he had given me the car, the Blazer. So I traded my Blazer for that. But anyway, that's you were setting up the story.
Yes. And you were there at work, but I think maybe you were doing deliveries in a work vehicle. And that day when dad found out, and I do not recall the specific details of that, but dad caught wind of it. And I believe that he had someone drive with him to the water store and get your car and bring it back to the house. Because I remember that I kept this mental image of you walking home in the heat. Just walking and knowing with each step that you were getting closer to home, and the fear that you would be feeling about what was awaiting you. And I think somehow, I don't know if you had a cell phone at this time, but he let you know somehow that he was taking the car, I believe.
Yes. Yeah.
And so then you had the dread. You knew exactly what was going on, and your worst memories were about to be replayed somehow.
So I remember after he got the car and I was walking home, the next morning, like I was scheduled to go into work. It was like a full-time job. I was scheduled to go in at 8, and I was so like destroyed from everything that happened. And like, of course, he and mom had another, like they all run together now, but like he and mom had another meeting with me when I got home, like the ones from the first go around. So like, again, like it's apocalyptic in nature. And I remember the shame I had the next morning when I called into work and quit over the phone. Cause I was just like, I just said like, I can't come in like ever. Like, I remember like choking back tears to do it, cause it was so embarrassing to have to call in and be like, yeah, I know I'm supposed to be there now, but I'm not coming in today. And I quit. Like, I'm never coming in. Cause I just knew like, there's not going to be any semblance of like normal life that you can have. Like, this was going to dominate everything in my life. So I was just like, I can't. But I remember, like, I've thought about that for years and years, like how embarrassing that was and even is, where I was like, I've never done anything like that before or since, but just to call in and be like, yeah, I quit, like no notice. And it was like, oh, I hated that. But
it's kind of amazing that you were able to make the call.
Barely.
I mean,
yeah. But I do remember, and this particular thing happened twice that I recall. But I do remember during this time when it happened a second time with this girl, that was where in that meeting with mom, where he said he didn't know if I could be saved, essentially, could be redeemed, because at that point I was baptized. Like, there are no excuses. I'm not like a kid or unbaptized. So it had extra weight to it. So, of course, I remember after that, and this isn't the only time that this happened. It's a common thread that we've talked about, but went through a depressive state after that, and very much thought about killing myself and maybe how. But then I would always think like, well, that's going to destroy mom. Yeah. I remember that being like my main worry is like, well, she didn't do anything. Like, mom's going to be absolutely destroyed if I kill myself. But I wanted to be dead for sure at that point. And I'm sure I'll talk about it in another episode, but he said the same thing to me again when I was in my mid-20s, probably. that he didn't know. If I could be saved, I may have just done too much and gone too far. And it was kind of the same thing again, like mental state wise for me, where I was like, well, I'd probably be good if I just figured out how to die.
It's incredible that he was able to place himself in a position of being the authority over whether someone could be forgiven or not.
Well, and back to what we've talked about so many times in these episodes, like there was a razor thin margin between dad and God as far as we were concerned. It wasn't just, oh, your dad's saying something that you can be like, I don't believe him. Like, no.
I know, that's what I mean. It's
Yeah.
amazing that he was able to create that, because that just gave him all the power.
But those moments for me, like when I just think about like my childhood and upbringing in the church, like they're very big and looming when I just think about like life and growing up in the church and with dad. Those were the big moments for me, is when, I had gone too far as he/God was concerned.
How did that change you? Or did it change you in any way? Those pivotal moments, like, did you operate differently after that in any way?
I don't know. Did I, from your perspective looking in?
Like just...
You're talking about like with dad or just generally?
like for example, when I talked about like the really harsh beating with me, where I thought to myself, okay, from now on, I'm never going to do anything wrong enough that would bring something like this about. And so then I just think I really became hyper fixated on perfection at that point, and just trying to be perfect and trying not to do anything wrong. And I just wonder if anything happened inside you where, that was such a huge moment for you in time, did you operate differently after that as a result?
I do have an answer for that.
Okay.
And it is no, because after all that happened, the way I felt a lot of shame, and I felt like I was and was always going to be like the f up. Like it was just, I'm not going to be Michael. I'm not going to be Sarah. I'm going to do shit like this. I'm always going to bring some kind of like shame on mom and dad. Not that I was like, screw it, I'm going to do whatever.
Yeah.
But it was almost like, this is just
Resignation.
This is just who I am. So I guess this is how it's going to be. This is how I remember feeling. So not that I just like leaned into anything to try to be bad by their standard, but I wasn't thinking like, I'm going to try so hard to stay on the straight and narrow. I just figured like, I guess this is just who I am.
Because it was kind of taught to you that you really couldn't do
Yeah.
enough.
Yeah. Yeah. I had to kind of resign myself to where I knew I wasn't going to live up to what he wanted. So I was just going to do what I could, and try to be useful in other ways, which I definitely did lean into that. I was going to try to do things to the highest level possible and be as good as I could at this and at that to try to make up for it. But I always knew like I knew what he wanted out of me and that I wasn't ever going to be that. So I wasn't going to try to make myself into something that I wasn't. I was going to try to do what I knew I could do well. And hopefully that would counter and be good enough to not, I guess be good enough to be worthy of something that resembled love, I guess.
Yeah. I think that's really a common theme throughout our childhoods is you had to work for love. You were not inherently worthy of it at all. I mean, Jen, you found that out after a certain point, then you started getting love from Dad. Like, but it apparently was not deserved before a certain point.
Withholding affection and things like that. I've even noticed, like in my marriage with Liz, I've had to fight myself to not do things like that, because she will not do something the way I had it in my head that I wanted it to be done. She doesn't know. I didn't say, can you do XYZ like this? But it's like with Dad, where it's like, I think that she should know.
Yeah.
And if she doesn't do it the way that my preference is, then I'm going to ice her out. Now, luckily I feel like I don't do that, and she can speak to that.
Yeah.
I feel like I don't do that anymore, or at least nothing like what I did. But I know early on in our marriage, like I really had to fight through that, because that was what was modeled to me. And not to pass it off as all dads, we all have a choice in how we treat other people. But I really had to work through that to not just live that out with my family.
So did I.
Yeah.
It's just ingrained in us.
Well, another huge theme for you is the inability to accept love. You have struggled feeling unworthy of people's love for you, which, again, was difficult to be someone that was like in your corner always and would advocate for you and support you, knowing that you could only really accept or believe so much of what we were trying to give. I think sometimes you have almost pushed away love that was coming your way, because as young kids, some of us maybe to more or lesser degrees, but all of us experienced that we were not worthy of love. And so that this show of affection or the expression of love was withdrawn. And when anybody would ever make any comments about how the love was conditional, you said that to me, Ash, like, Mom and Dad didn't love me unconditionally. And I think my response to you was, of course they did. They loved you, but it's almost like, how do you know though? Because there was no expression of love, but the line was, well, we did though. We still love you. It's just so dysfunctional. It's hard to even get it all straight. But, as little kids, when you're taught that your value and your worth is tied to the things that you do, that this person wants you to do and the way they want it done, you don't feel worthy of love when you don't do well. And ironically, that's when you need the most love.
And also, it's super painful to have it and then have it taken away. So maybe part of the pushing away, Mattie, is that you don't want to go through the pain of losing it again. So it's easier not to embrace it than to have it and then you have no control over when it's like just yanked away.
I know also this is probably part of it. Like Liz, I don't do this as much because I'm trying to work through this in our joint podcast therapy sessions, which is what this is. I'm trying to work through this stuff and have done a better job, but she would come up and want a hug, and she would give me a hug and say like, you're a good husband. And then my immediate reaction every time, I would always say like, no, I'm not.
Yeah.
Because it's not that, it's like, I feel like, well, not really. Like, you don't know.
Yeah.
Like you almost like hearkening back to like, well, if you knew what Dad knew, you'd know.
That's exactly it. I thought that for years too.
Yeah. Like you're wrong because you just don't have the secret knowledge that he does. And he knows I'm not good. I know you think I'm good, but not really. So it's like I had to fight through that and just take people's compliments and love and nice things they had to say for what it was. And like Liz and I talked about this in the car the other day on the way to or from work, where she said, you know, it's invalidating to people when they give a compliment and then you like don't accept it from them. It makes them feel like you don't care about what they have to say or what they think. So that has been helpful for me in thinking like, well, what is this person feeling like when they give me a compliment or they say something nice to me? I should be willing to accept that and not dismiss it, because from where I'm coming from, I'm not dismissing it because I don't care about them. I'm dismissing it because I think there's somebody who knows better than them about me, you know, or I know better. Like I know I'm not good.
And it's your parent, which I think is the only person that could really instill that in someone. I also had that too. Just like, well, you don't know me as well. Like you think you know me, but you don't. The person that knows me better than anybody else can't even have me in his life at all. Like I'm too bad and too dangerous. So
that's exactly it.
Yeah. Like if you knew me as well as him, you would see whatever that is.
You don't know how much I've screwed up.
Right. Yeah.
Is what it is.
You don't know how flawed.
Yes.
Because he had special insight into your soul.
Yeah.
And the state of your soul and your heart.
And even though, like, at least for me, I'm like, well, I don't know exactly what it is. It's just inherently wrong and bad about me, but he does. He saw it. And if he saw it, then if I let someone else too close to me, then they might also see it. And then they'll leave. I think it's hardest for our spouses, honestly. Because they're the ones that help us work through these things.
Sorry, guys.
I'm that way about the compliments too, though. I used to always argue with the compliment. And yeah, it's uncomfortable, but I have learned to just say thank you.
Not me, guys. Thank you so much.
Well, lucky you.
I know.
I know I'm awesome.
You're telling me.
If you like this episode of The Cult Next Door, please leave us a positive review and rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And don't forget to subscribe to be notified of new episodes.